The fluorescent lights of the Blue Moon Diner buzzed softly as Ming wiped down the counter for the 100th time that night. It was that strange hour between midnight and sunrise when the world seemed to pause, when truck drivers and night shift workers sought refuge in cups of coffee and plates of scrambled eggs. The sound of rain tapping against the windows created a gentle rhythm, and Ming found herself humming along, creating a melody that had been floating in her head all week. Her notepad, stuffed in her apron pocket, was filled with more song lyrics than food orders these days. More coffee, Han. She called out to old Mr. Lee, a retired mailman who came in every night at 2 a.m. sharp. He nodded with a gentle smile, and she grabbed the coffee pot, still humming. The tune was about chasing dreams under city lights, inspired by all the stories she'd heard across this counter. The diner sat on the corner of Main and Oak, its neon sign a beacon for lost souls and dreamers. Ming had been working here for 3 years now, taking double shifts whenever she could. During the day, she served business people their quick lunches, and at night, she listened to the hopes and heartbreaks of insomniacs and night owls. Between refills and orders, she'd duck into the kitchen, pulling out her notepad to scribble down lyrics. Tonight's song was coming together piece by piece. Midnight coffee, stories sweet, where dreamers and drifters meet. The kitchen staff had gotten used to her musical moments, sometimes even offering rhymes of their own. Her tiny apartment above Wong's grocery store wasn't much, but it was home. There, propped against her second-hand couch, stood her most precious possession, a guitar she'd named Starlight. She'd found it at a pawn shop 6 months ago, and even though the store owner said it was just an old Yamaha with a few scratches, to Ming, it was pure magic. Every morning after her shift, she'd climb the creaky stairs to her apartment, kick off her shoes, and pick up Starlight. Her fingers would be tired from carrying plates, but they'd come alive on the strings. She taught herself to play through YouTube videos and free online lessons, staying up way too late practicing chords until her fingertips grew calloused. The regulars of the diner had become her first fans, though they didn't know it yet. There was Raj, the taxi driver who always ordered a slice of apple pie, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who worked the night shift at the hospital. They'd inspired characters in her songs, their stories weaving into melodies she hummed while refilling sugar dispensers. That night, as she counted her tips, Ming found a napkin stuffed between the dollar bills. On it, someone had written, "Your voice makes the night shift bearable. You should be on stage." She smiled, folding the napkin carefully and tucking it into her pocket with her other treasured notes and lyrics. The owner of the diner, Mr. Kim, pretended not to notice when she sang softly while mopping the floors after closing. Sometimes she caught him tapping his foot along with her made-up tunes. Once, he even mentioned that his cousin owned a small music shop downtown where local bands sometimes played on weekends. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, Ming gathered her things from her locker in the back room. Her notepad was fuller than when her shift began. 3 new verses and a chorus, born between coffee refills and midnight orders. Tomorrow, she'd try them out on Starlight, adding another song to her growing collection. Walking home in the early morning light, she passed by the local radio station where they sometimes featured upcoming artists. One day, she whispered to herself, clutching her notepad a little tighter. The city was waking up around her, but Ming was already dreaming of the next night, the next song, the next step towards something bigger than midnight coffee runs and fluorescent lights. She didn't know it yet, but the napkin in her pocket would turn out to be more than just another nice note from a customer. The Blue Moon Diner was about to become more than just a late-night eatery. It was about to become the first chapter in a story that would change her life. The man in the brown leather jacket always sat in booth 7, right by the window where the neon sign cast a soft blue glow. He'd been coming to the Blue Moon Diner every Tuesday and Thursday for the past month, always ordering the same thing: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and endless cups of coffee. Ming had noticed how his fingers would tap against the ceramic mug, creating complex rhythms that seemed to dance with her hummed melodies. One particularly quiet night, while she was wiping down nearby tables and softly singing a song she'd written about city lights and midnight dreams, she caught him watching. Not in the usual way customers sometimes stared, but with the focused attention of someone who knew music. "That's an interesting chord progression you're humming there," he said, his voice warm and weathered like his jacket. "Reminds me of some old folk songs, but with a modern twist." Ming felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't realized she'd been singing loud enough for anyone to hear. "Oh, it's just something I made up," she replied, tucking her cleaning cloth into her apron pocket. The man introduced himself as Mr. Chen, a retired musician who'd played guitar for several well-known bands in his younger days. "I've played everything from smoky bars to concert halls," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "But sometimes the best music I've heard has been in unexpected places, like diners at 3 a.m. That night, instead of rushing home to Starlight, Ming found herself sitting across from Mr. Chen during her break, scribbling notes on order pad papers as he explained music theory in terms of coffee cups and sugar packets. "See, if these sugar packets are your basic chord progression," he demonstrated, arranging them on the table, "then this creamer here would be your bridge." The other regulars watched with amusement. Mrs. Rodriguez from the hospital whispered to Raj, the taxi driver, "About time someone noticed that girl's talent." Mr. Kim, pretending to check the coffee machines, lingered nearby, listening to Mr. Chen's impromptu music lesson. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Chen became more than just the man in booth 7. He started bringing his own guitar, an old Gibson that had clearly seen thousands of performances. After the midnight rush, when the diner quieted down, he'd take it out and show Ming different strumming patterns. Sometimes, other customers would stop their conversations to listen, the usual late-night chatter giving way to soft acoustic melodies. "Music isn't just about getting the notes right," Mr. Chen would say, watching Ming practice finger positions during her breaks. "It's about telling your story. And kid, you've got stories worth telling." One night, after a particularly busy shift, Mr. Chen stayed until closing time. As Ming stacked the last chairs on tables, he pulled something from his jacket pocket. A business card, worn at the edges, but still crisp enough to read. "I know some people at the back room," he said, referring to a small but well-respected music venue downtown. "They do open McNights on Wednesdays. Think about it." Ming held the card like it was made of glass. The back room was where local musicians went when they were serious about their craft. She'd walked past it countless times, always wondering what it would feel like to stand on that stage. "I haven't really performed in front of people," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just the night shift crew here." Mr. Chen smiled, gathering his guitar case. "Everyone starts somewhere. Besides," he gestured around the diner, "you've been performing here every night. The only difference is, at the back room, people are actually listening." As she locked up that morning, Ming felt something shift in the air, like the moment just before sunrise when night decides to give way to day. The business card in her pocket seemed to pulse with possibility. Her regular customers had become her first audience, this diner her first stage, and now, somehow, the next step of her journey had walked in and sat down in booth 7. Walking home, she held Starlight's case a little tighter, her mind already writing new lyrics about unexpected mentors and chances that arrive with the midnight coffee crowd. The city was waking up around her, but for once, Ming wasn't thinking about sleep. She was thinking about Wednesdays at the back room, and how sometimes the biggest dreams start with scrambled eggs and a cup of coffee. The back room wasn't what Ming had imagined. Standing outside the brick building on her first Wednesday night off, she'd expected something intimidating. Instead, she found a cozy space with mismatched chairs and string lights crisscrossing the ceiling. The stage was barely 6 inches off the ground, just a platform with a microphone stand and a stool. She'd spent the past 2 weeks practicing with Mr. Chen during her breaks at the diner. Her fingers were sore from pressing guitar strings, and her voice was scratchy from singing late into the mornings after her shifts. But she had 3 songs ready, all originals, just like Mr. Chen had insisted. Covers are fine, he told her, but your stories are what make you special. The crowd at the back room was small but attentive. Ming recognized a few faces. There was the bookstore owner from down the street, a couple of college students who sometimes stopped by the diner for late-night study sessions, and surprisingly, Mr. Kim from the diner, trying to look inconspicuous in the back corner. When the host called her name, Ming's legs felt like they were made of jelly. She carefully took Starlight out of its case, the familiar weight of the guitar providing some comfort. As she settled onto the stool, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's voice in her head. Just pretend you're singing at the diner, honey. We're all friends here. Her first song was about the night shift, about dreams being born under fluorescent lights and hope served with cups of coffee. Her voice shook at first, but by the chorus, she found her rhythm. The audience leaned in, nodding along, and she saw a few people close their eyes, smiling as if the lyrics had touched something familiar in their own hearts. The second song came easier, and by the third, Ming forgot to be nervous. She was just telling her stories, just like she did at the diner. When she finished, the applause felt warm and genuine. Mr. Chen, sitting near the front, gave her a subtle thumbs up. After her performance, a woman with silver-streaked hair approached her. "I run a small recording studio downtown," she said, handing Ming a card. "Nothing fancy, but we offer reasonable rates for new artists. Your songs deserve to be recorded properly." Ming's heart raced as she looked at the card. Recording studio rates weren't cheap. She knew that from her research. But she had been saving tips for months, tucking away every extra dollar in a jar labeled Music Dreams hidden in her kitchen cabinet. The next day at work, her regular customers wanted to hear all about her performance. Raj had already seen a video someone had posted online of her first song. "My daughter showed it to me," he beamed proudly, as if Ming was his own child. "She says you're going to be famous." Mr. Kim surprised her by adjusting her schedule. "Wednesday's off now," he said gruffly, trying to hide his smile. "For music things." The other waitresses offered to cover more of her night shifts so she could practice and perform. The cook started humming her songs while flipping pancakes. Mr. Chen kept coming to the diner, but now their lessons were more focused. He taught her about microphone technique, stage presence, and how to connect with an audience. "Music is a conversation," he'd say, demonstrating how to make eye contact while performing. "You're not just singing at people, you're sharing something with them." The recording studio card sat on Ming's dresser for a week before she finally gathered the courage to call. The woman remembered her and offered a special rate for first-time artists. 4 hours of studio time for the price of 2. It would still take most of her savings, but when Ming looked at herself in the mirror that night, guitar in hand, she knew it was time to take the next step. That evening at the diner, she served coffee with an extra spring in her step. Her notepad was filling up with new songs. About taking chances, about the friends who become family, about the courage it takes to chase a dream. Between orders, she practiced the harmony Mr. Chen had taught her, and even the truckers who usually kept to themselves looked up and smiled. The city lights seemed brighter that night, as if they too were celebrating this small but significant step forward. Ming had found her voice, not just in music, but in life. The diner was still her anchor, but now it felt less like a place she worked and more like the first chapter of her story. A story that was just beginning to unfold. The notice appeared on a Tuesday morning, taped to the diner's front door in stark black and white. "Property for sale." 3 simple words that made Ming's stomach drop. Mr. Kim gathered all the staff in the quiet hour between breakfast and lunch to break the news. The building's owner was selling the whole block to developers. 3 months, he said, his voice unusually soft. "Maybe 4, if we're lucky." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, suddenly feeling much harsher than before. The news spread quickly through their little community. Regular customers came in with worried faces, asking what they could do to help. Raj started a petition. Mrs. Rodriguez called her nephew who worked at the local newspaper. But the price of the property was too high, and the developer's plans too firm. That night, Ming couldn't focus during her performance at the back room. Her fingers kept slipping on starlight strings, and her voice cracked during the high notes of her newest song. The audience was kind, but she could see Mr. Chen wincing slightly in the back row. After her set, he didn't come over with his usual constructive criticism. Instead, he just gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder and said, "Some nights are harder than others." The next few weeks blurred together. Ming picked up extra shifts as other waitresses started looking for new jobs. The music festival she'd been preparing for, her biggest opportunity yet, was approaching fast, but her heart wasn't in the practice sessions. Every time she tried to write new songs, all that came out were sad melodies about loss and endings. One particularly rough night, after mixing up 3 orders and breaking a coffee pot, Ming retreated to the back alley behind the diner. She sat on an old milk crate, starlight across her lap, and let the tears finally come. That's where the cook found her, still holding her guitar but not playing. "You know," he said, lighting a cigarette, "I've worked in 15 different diners over 30 years. Every single one had a story, but none of them had a songwriter to tell it." His words struck something in Ming. That night, after her shift, she didn't go home. She stayed at her usual booth, watching the sunrise through the window, and wrote. She wrote about the coffee-stained menus and the cracked vinyl seats, about Mr. Kim's gruff kindness and Mrs. Rodriguez's late-night stories, about Raj's jokes and the way the cook hummed along to her songs while flipping burgers. The morning of the music festival pre-show arrived gray and drizzly. Ming hadn't slept much, but there was a new song in her notebook, one that felt different from anything she'd written before. Mr. Chen was there, front row, as she walked onto the biggest stage she'd faced yet. "This isn't the song I was planning to play," she told the audience, adjusting her microphone. "But sometimes life changes your plans." Her fingers found the chords, and she began to sing about a place where dreams were served with midnight coffee, where strangers became family, and where even endings could become beautiful beginnings. She didn't see the festival organizer recording on his phone, didn't notice how the crowd had gone completely silent, or how even the stagehands had stopped to listen. All she felt was the truth of every word, the reality of every note. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story of every person who'd ever found home in an unexpected place. When she finished, the silence lasted a heartbeat too long. Then the applause started, scattered at first, then building. Mr. Chen was on his feet, hands cupped around his mouth, shouting "Bravo!" Someone in the back whistled. The festival organizer was already making his way toward the stage. Back at the diner that night, Ming served coffee with red-rimmed eyes, but a lighter heart. The notice on the door hadn't changed, but something inside her had. Mr. Kim came out of his office with printouts of possible new locations for the diner. "Maybe," he said, studying a particularly promising option, "endings aren't always endings." Ming looked around at the familiar walls, at the customers who'd become family, at the place where her dreams had first found their voice. She couldn't save the building, but maybe she could preserve its spirit in her songs. After all, some stories were too important to be forgotten, even if their setting had to change. The video went up on a Wednesday night. Someone for the music festival had posted Ming's performance online with a simple caption: "The singing waitress of Blue Moon Diner." By Thursday morning, it had already been shared thousands of times. Ming didn't know about any of this until Raj burst into the diner during her morning shift, his taxi still running outside. "Check your phone," he shouted, waving his own phone in the air. "You're everywhere." The comments under the video were full of people sharing their own stories about diners that had closed, about places that felt like home, about dreams that seemed just out of reach. Some talked about driving across town just to visit the Blue Moon before it closed. Others asked where they could hear more of Ming's music. The little bell above the diner's door kept ringing as new customers streamed in. Young people with cameras, local news reporters, musicians from nearby cities, all wanting to see the place that inspired the song. Mr. Kim had to call in extra staff to handle the sudden rush. Table 6 wants to know if you'll sing while they eat. The new waitress whispered to Ming, who was balancing 3 plates of eggs and trying to keep up with the orders. And Table 4 is asking about your recording schedule. That afternoon, Ming's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. It was a small record label based in the city. "We've been looking for artists who tell real stories," the woman on the phone said. "Stories that matter to real people. Would you be interested in recording an EP?" The cook found Ming in the back alley again, but this time she wasn't crying. She was sitting on her milk crate, staring at her phone in disbelief. "They want to record my songs," she said softly. "Real studio time. Real producers." "About time," he grinned, flipping his spatula. "But who's going to help me name the daily specials when you're famous?" The next few weeks felt like a dream. Ming split her time between serving coffee and meeting with the record label. They wanted to record 5 songs, including the one about the diner. Mr. Chen helped her select which songs to include, spending hours after closing time working on arrangements. "Remember," he'd say, adjusting her guitar strap, "they didn't fall in love with some polished pop star. They fell in love with the waitress who sings from her heart. Don't lose that." The diner's closure date was still looming, but something had shifted. Local businesses started hosting Save the Blue Moon fundraisers. A coffee shop down the street offered to hire any staff who needed jobs. Someone started an online fundraising campaign to help Mr. Kim find a new location. One morning, a woman in a business suit came in for coffee. She sat at the counter, watching Ming serve customers and hum between orders. "I'm from the city's Historical Preservation Committee," she said when Ming refilled her cup. "We've been following your story. Did you know this building is old enough to qualify for landmark status?" The Preservation Committee meeting was scheduled for the following week. The hearing room was packed with diner regulars. Mrs. Rodriguez brought homemade cookies. Raj handed out Save the Blue Moon buttons he'd had made. The cook left his grill for the first time in 5 years to speak about the diner's importance to the community. Ming was the last to testify. Instead of speaking, she asked if she could sing. Right there, in the formal hearing room, with its wooden panels and fluorescent lights, she pulled out Starlight and sang about midnight dreams and coffee-flavored hope. When the committee voted to grant the diner landmark status, protecting it from demolition, the cheer could be heard all the way down the street. Mr. Kim tried to hide his tears behind his usual gruff expression, but everyone saw him dabbing his eyes with a napkin. That night, the diner was fuller than ever. The record label people sat in one booth, going over contract details. The Preservation Committee celebrated with pie in another. Regular customers mixed with new faces, all sharing stories about what the Blue Moon meant to them. Ming moved between tables with her coffee pot, still wearing her name tag, still taking orders. But now she also had a small notebook tucked in her apron pocket, filling up with new songs about unexpected miracles and dreams that come true in surprising ways. Sometimes the best success stories don't take you away from where you started. They just help you see your beginnings in a whole new light. Recording an EP was nothing like Ming had imagined. The studio was in an old converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and wooden beams. Her first day there, she stood in the recording booth, headphones pressed against her ears, feeling like an imposter in someone else's dream. "Just pretend you're at the diner," the sound engineer said through the intercom. "Sing it like you're telling a story to your regulars." It took 14 takes to get the first song right. Not because Ming couldn't hit the notes. She could, but because the pristine studio version felt too polished, too perfect. It was Mr. Chen who finally suggested bringing Starlight to the studio instead of using their expensive guitars. The familiar weight of her own instrument made all the difference. Between recording sessions, Ming still worked her shifts at the Blue Moon. The diner had changed since receiving landmark status. Tourism websites listed it as a must-visit musical landmark, and people would come from neighboring cities just to sit in the booth where she'd written her viral song. "Your coffee's getting cold," she'd tell the customers who were too busy filming her for their social media. Some nights, she missed the quiet of the old late shift, when it was just her, the regulars, and the humming fluorescent lights. The record label wanted her to do a small tour of local venues. Just 3 weeks, they said. 5 cities. Ming stared at the proposed schedule, her stomach twisting. 3 weeks meant 15 shifts at the diner. 15 nights of letting someone else serve her regular customers their midnight coffee. Mr. Kim found her in the kitchen after closing, studying the tour schedule with worried eyes. "You know," he said, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate movements, "I worked here 30 years before taking a vacation. Don't make my mistakes." But it wasn't just about the shifts. The diner was more than a job. It was where her music was born, where her songs found their first audience. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, felt like betraying a part of herself. The cook had a different perspective. "Music's like cooking," he said one morning while preparing the breakfast rush. "Sometimes you gotta try new kitchens to grow. Doesn't mean you forget your first stove." The decision came down to a quiet Tuesday night. A young girl, maybe 16, sat at the counter with her mother. She had a notebook full of song lyrics, and her hands shook slightly as she asked Ming for advice about pursuing music while staying in school. "I heard your story," the girl said softly, "about working here and not giving up on your dreams. It made me think maybe I could do it too." Ming looked around the diner, at the worn vinyl booths where she'd written her first songs, at the coffee-stained menus, at the regulars who'd become family. The place hadn't crumbled when she'd taken Wednesdays off for open mic nights. It hadn't fallen apart when she spent mornings in the recording studio. Maybe leaving didn't mean letting go. Maybe it meant making room for something new while keeping hold of what mattered most. The next day, Ming posted the schedule for her upcoming tour on the diner's bulletin board, right next to the daily specials. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately started planning a send-off party. Raj offered to drive her to the first venue in his taxi. The cook promised to write down all the customer stories she'd miss so she could turn them into songs when she got back. Mr. Kim called her into his office, gruffer than usual. "Your job," he said, not meeting her eyes, "it'll be here. When you're done being a rock star." Then he pulled out a paper bag containing 3 weeks' worth of his special diner blend coffee. "So you don't forget how home tastes." The record label wanted to film a music video before the tour. Ming had a better idea. She brought them to the diner during the midnight shift, when the neon lights painted everything in soft blues and pinks. They filmed her serving coffee, laughing with regulars, writing lyrics on paper napkins. They captured the real magic, not just of her music, but of the place that gave it life. That night, after the camera crew left, Ming sat in her usual booth with Starlight across her lap. Tomorrow, she'd start packing for the tour. But tonight, she had one more song to write, about how some places become part of who you are, how some dreams don't take you away from home, but instead show you all the different ways a heart can feel at home. 3 years could change a lot, Ming thought as she stood outside the Blue Moon Diner. The neon sign still buzzed with the same soft hum, but now it shared the street with trendy coffee shops and boutiques. Her old apartment above Wong's grocery had become a vintage record store. She wasn't just coming back to visit this time. The papers in her bag made that clear: property deeds, business licenses, renovation permits. The tour had grown from 5 cities to 50, then to other countries. Her songs about late-night dreams and coffee-stained hopes had resonated with people in ways she never imagined. The bell chimed as she pushed open the door. The familiar smell of coffee and griddle grease wrapped around her like an old friend's hug. Mr. Kim was at the counter, his hair a little grayer, but his movements just as precise as he counted the morning's receipts. "You're late," he said, not looking up, but she could see the smile tugging at his lips. "Staff meeting started 10 minutes ago." The staff room was packed. The cook was there, still wearing his apron. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought her famous cinnamon rolls. Raz sat next to Mr. Chen, both grinning like they knew a secret. Even some of the old regulars had squeezed in. Ming pulled out the papers from her bag, spreading them on the table. "So," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "remember how I said I wanted to buy the diner?" The room erupted in excited chatter. She'd been working on this for months, saving her tour earnings, talking to business advisors, learning everything she could about running a restaurant. But that wasn't all. "The back room," she continued, pointing to the renovation plans, "we're turning it into a proper music venue. Small stage, good sound system, open McNights." She turned to Mr. Chen. "And I'm hoping my old guitar teacher might help run it." Mr. Chen's eyes glistened as he nodded. About time this place got some proper acoustics. The renovation took 6 weeks. They kept the diner's soul intact. The same booths, the same counter, the same coffee machines that sometimes needed a gentle pat to work properly. But the back room transformed into something magical. The stage wasn't much bigger than the platform at the back room where Ming had first performed, but the sound system was top-notch, and the lighting made everyone look like a star. Opening night was a private affair, just the diner family and their closest friends. Ming stood on the new stage, starlight in her hands, looking out at the faces that had believed in her before anyone else did. "This song," she said into the microphone, "is for the dreamers who work double shifts. For the ones who write their hopes on paper napkins and practice guitar at 3 a.m. For everyone who's ever been told their dreams are too big for their beginnings." As she sang, more memories filled the room. The night she'd first hummed melodies while refilling coffee cups, the regulars who'd become her first fans, the setbacks that had nearly broken her, and the community that had held her together. The next morning, Ming put on an apron for the first time in 3 years. Her name tag was new, with owner engraved beneath her name, but the feeling was familiar. She still served coffee during the morning rush, still hummed while wiping down tables. The dinner crowd now included musicians setting up for evening performances. Young artists with notebooks full of lyrics would sit at the counter, ordering coffee and asking for advice. Ming would tell them what Mr. Chen had told her. "Your stories are what make you special." Late that night, after the last performer had packed up and the last customer had left, Ming sat in her old booth by the window. The neon sign painted the street in soft blue light, just like it always had. She pulled out her notebook, not for songs this time, but for a letter. "Dear future dreamer," she wrote, "welcome to the Blue Moon. Maybe you're here for the coffee or the music, or because you heard about the waitress who used to sing while serving midnight breakfast. Whatever brought you here, know this. Dreams don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they look like a diner at 3 a.m. Sometimes they sound like coffee cups clinking and old guitars strumming. Sometimes they taste like hope served hot with a side of courage. Pull up a chair. Add your voice to our story. The mic is yours, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say."